In the dead of winter, 1878, when a blizzard buried the Wyoming territory under 6 feet of snow, Colt Bennett made a choice that would change 2 lives forever. He found a woman dying in the drifts, a Boston aristocrat fleeing a nightmare of blood and ice. Most men would have ridden past, but Colt wasn't most men. What began as a rescue in the storm would become something far more dangerous, a love that defied every rule of their divided worlds. Stay with me until the end of this story, and leave a comment telling me what city you're watching from. I want to see how far this tale travels across the world. The wind howled like a dying animal across the Wyoming plains, carrying with it a cold so fierce it could freeze a man's breath in his lungs before he could exhale. It was the kind of cold that killed, quick and merciless, and on this January night in 1878 it was hunting. Evelyn Hart knew she was dying. Each step through the snow was agony. Her legs, numb from the knees down, barely responded to her commands. The silk gown she'd worn for the journey, powder blue with ivory lace, a gift from her father before he'd passed, hung in frozen tatters around her body. The fabric, once soft and beautiful, now crackled like glass with every movement. Her hands, delicate hands that had never known labor, were raw and bleeding. The skin split open from clawing through ice and bramble. Behind her, perhaps a quarter-mile back, lay the overturned stagecoach. She couldn't see it anymore through the whiteout, but she could still hear the screams in her mind. The driver's shout of warning, the sickening crack of wood splintering, the horses' terrified shrieks as they went down. Mrs. Patterson's final gasp as the luggage trunk crushed her chest. The young banker from Philadelphia, whose name she'd never learned, drowning in his own blood as he tried to crawl from the wreckage. 5 souls had boarded that stage in Fort Collins. Now there was only one, stumbling blindly through a storm that didn't care about her breeding, her education, or the fact that she was supposed to arrive in Cheyenne tomorrow to plan her wedding to a man she'd never loved. "Help!" she tried to call, but her voice was nothing more than a whisper stolen by the wind. "Please, someone—" The snow was to her thighs now, each step requiring her to lift her entire leg up and forward, then plunge it down again into the uncertain depth below. Her lungs burned with every breath of the frigid air. Ice had formed in her hair, pulling at her scalp. She'd lost feeling in her ears an hour ago, or was it 2 hours? Time had become as fluid and meaningless as the snow swirling around her. "This is how I die," she thought with a strange clarity. "Alone in the wilderness, and no one will ever know what happened to me." Her Uncle Henry would wait at the Cheyenne station, checking his pocket watch with increasing anxiety. Her fiancé, Theodore Blackwood III, would be furious at the inconvenience, though he'd make the appropriate shows of grief for society's sake. The wedding would be canceled. Her mother's friends in Boston would whisper about the tragedy over tea, using her death as a cautionary tale about the dangers of the West. And then, after a few months, she would be forgotten entirely. The thought should have terrified her, but instead, Evelyn felt a strange sense of peace. At least she'd escaped the golden cage that had been closing around her. At least she'd die free. Her foot caught on something beneath the snow. A root, a rock, it didn't matter. And she went down hard. The impact drove what little air remained from her lungs. She lay there, face pressed into the snow, and for a long moment she considered simply staying there. It would be so easy, so painless. The cold was already numbing her, turning her limbs heavy and her thoughts slow. They said freezing to death was like falling asleep. "Get up," she whispered to herself. "Get up, Evelyn. Get up." But her body wouldn't obey. The will that had carried her this far, the same stubborn will that had made her the despair of every governess and the pride of her father, was finally spent. "I'm sorry, Papa," she thought. "I tried." The snow continued to fall, beginning to cover her like a shroud. 600 yards to the north, Colt Bennett sat astride his gray gelding, Thor, and squinted into the storm. He'd been riding the fence line when the blizzard hit, checking for breaks before the worst of winter settled in. Most men would have turned back an hour ago, sought shelter and warmth. But Colt had learned long ago that most men was a category he didn't fit into, for better or worse. At 32, he'd spent more than a decade working cattle on the high plains. He knew this land the way a sailor knows the sea, its moods, its dangers, its rare mercies. He knew how to read the wind, how to find water under ice, how to tell the difference between a coyote's cry and a wolf's howl at 300 yards in the dark. And right now, every instinct he'd honed over those hard years was telling him something was wrong. Thor sensed it too. The horse's ears kept swiveling southeast toward something Colt couldn't see through the white curtain of snow. The gelding, usually steady as stone, was dancing nervously, tossing his head. "Easy, boy," Colt murmured, his voice barely audible over the wind. "What have you got?" He'd learned to trust the horse's instincts. Thor had saved his life twice, once by refusing to cross a snow bridge over a ravine that collapsed minutes later, and once by bolting away from what Colt had thought was a shadow, but turned out to be a mountain lion crouched in the rocks. Colt pulled his wool scarf down from his face, ignoring the immediate bite of the cold on his weathered skin. He was a tall man, lean and hard from constant work, with dark hair that hung to his collar and eyes the color of smoke. His face bore the lines of someone who'd seen too much, lost too much, but survived anyway. "Show me," he said, giving Thor his head. The gelding needed no further encouragement. He pushed forward through the drifts with the powerful gait of a working horse, his breath coming in great plumes of steam. Colt hunched low over the saddle, protecting his face from the worst of the wind, trusting Thor to find whatever had spooked him. They rode for perhaps 10 minutes, though distance was impossible to gauge in the whiteout. Then Thor stopped abruptly, whinnying and backing up a few steps. Colt looked down. At first he thought it was just a drift, a peculiar formation of snow sculpted by the wind. Then he saw the color, a hint of blue, nearly buried. He dismounted in one smooth motion, his boots sinking deep into the powder. "Jesus Christ," he breathed. It was a woman. She lay face down in the snow, so still that for a terrible moment he was certain she was dead. Colt dropped to his knees beside her, yanking off his glove with his teeth. He pressed 2 fingers to her neck, searching for a pulse. There. Faint and thready, but there. "Ma'am?" he called, his voice sharp with urgency. "Ma'am, can you hear me?" No response. Her skin was pale as marble, her lips tinged blue. Ice crystals had formed in her dark hair, and when he carefully turned her over, he saw that her eyes were closed, the lashes frosted white. She was young, early 20s, he guessed, with delicate features that spoke of a life far removed from this brutal wilderness. Even half frozen and covered in blood from a gash above her eyebrow, he could see she was beautiful in that refined, untouchable way of women from back east, the kind of woman who belonged in drawing rooms and ballrooms, not dying in a Wyoming blizzard. What the hell was she doing out here? The question would have to wait. Right now, she had minutes, maybe less. Colt looked around quickly, trying to orient himself. His ranch was close, 3/4 of a mile, perhaps a mile. He could make it if he rode hard, but could she survive the journey in this condition? She had to, because the alternative was leaving her here to die, and that wasn't something Colt Bennett could do. Not again. He shrugged out of his heavy wool coat, wrapping it around her trembling frame. She was light, too light. When he lifted her into his arms, her head lolled against his chest, and he could feel how cold she was even through his shirt. "You're not dying today," he told her firmly, as if he could command death itself to back down. "You hear me? You'll make it home with me." Getting her onto Thor was a challenge. The gelding stood steady, bless him, while Colt carefully positioned himself in the saddle and then pulled the woman up in front of him. He settled her against his chest, holding her secure with one arm while guiding Thor with the other. "Go, boy, home, fast as you can manage." Thor needed no urging. The horse knew the way even in the storm, and he struck out with purpose, following instincts and memory where sight was useless. Colt held the woman tight, trying to share what warmth he could, though he could feel the cold seeping into his own bones now, without his coat. "Stay with me," he murmured against her hair. "We're almost there, just hold on a little longer." She didn't respond, didn't move, but he could feel the shallow rise and fall of her chest against his arm. Still breathing, still fighting, even if she didn't know it. The ride was both endless and too short. Colt's arms ached from holding her, his face had gone numb from the wind, and he'd lost feeling in his toes. But finally, he saw the golden glow of lamplight through the snow. His ranch house, solid and welcoming, materialized out of the storm like a ship emerging from fog. "Nora!" he shouted as Thor carried them into the yard. Nora, I need help. The door flew open before they'd even stopped. Nora Alvarez, his housekeeper, and the closest thing to family he had left, stood backlit in the doorway. She was a sturdy woman in her 50s, with iron gray hair and hands that could birth a calf, set a broken bone, or bake bread that made men weep, sometimes all in the same day. One look at Colt's burden and her eyes went wide. Dios mío, she gasped. What? Found her in the snow, Colt interrupted, dismounting awkwardly with his unconscious cargo. She's alive, but barely. I need hot water, blankets, and every bit of warmth we can give her. Nora was already moving. Her initial shock transformed into efficient action. Bring her to the kitchen. The stove's hottest there. Maria, she called over her shoulder to her daughter. Stoke the fire and heat water. Rapido. Colt carried the woman inside, grateful for the blast of warmth that hit him as he crossed the threshold. The ranch house wasn't fancy. Rough-hewn timber walls, simple furniture built for function rather than beauty. But it was solid and warm, heated by a massive stone fireplace in the main room and the cast-iron stove in the kitchen. He laid her on the kitchen table as gently as he could. Up close, in the lamplight, she looked even worse than he'd thought. Her skin had a grayish tinge, her breathing was labored, and when Nora began to peel away the frozen layers of her dress, they found her skin mottled with frostbite. Strip her down, Nora ordered, all business now. Everything wet has to come off. Maria, those blankets. And bring my sewing kit. She's got a nasty cut on her head that'll need stitching. For the next hour, Colt's kitchen became a makeshift hospital. Between the three of them, they worked to save the stranger's life. They removed the frozen dress, revealing a body so thin and cold it hurt to look at. They wrapped her in warm blankets, placed heated stones around her to raise her temperature slowly. Too fast would be dangerous. Nora cleaned and stitched the gash on her forehead with practiced skill, muttering prayers in Spanish as she worked. Colt paced the kitchen like a caged animal, unable to sit still, watching the woman's face for any sign of improvement. Her breathing remained shallow but steady. The color, or what little there was, didn't get any worse. Once her eyelids fluttered, and he thought she might wake, but she settled back into unconsciousness. "Who is she?" Maria whispered. The girl was 18, with her mother's kind eyes and her late father's shy smile. "Don't know," Colt replied, his voice rough. "Haven't found any papers or identification. But given how she was dressed..." He gestured to the ruined blue silk, now crumpled in a wet heap by the door. "She's quality. Eastern, I'd wager. Boston or Philadelphia." "Long way from home," Nora observed, securing the last bandage. She pressed the back of her hand to the woman's forehead, checking for fever. "What was she doing out in that storm?" "That's what I aim to find out," Colt said. "Soon as she can talk." "If she can talk," Nora corrected gently. "Colt, she's bad off. The frostbite, the exposure. Even if she wakes up, there could be damage we can't see." "She'll make it," Colt said with a certainty he didn't quite feel. "She's a fighter, I can tell." Nora gave him a long, measuring look. "You don't even know her name." "Doesn't matter. She needed help, and I found her. That's enough." What he didn't say, what he couldn't say, even to Nora who'd known him for 8 years, was that he'd seen something in the woman's face, even unconscious and half frozen. A desperation, a determination to survive. It reminded him of himself 3 years ago, when his world had fallen apart and he'd had to choose between giving up or going on. She'd chosen to go on, fighting through that storm until her body simply couldn't anymore. That took courage. That took a strength most people didn't possess. He respected that. "Let's get her by the fire," he said. "She'll rest better there, and it's warmer than the kitchen will be once that stove dies down." Between them, they carried her, still wrapped in blankets like a cocoon, to the main room. Colt had built up the fire until it roared in the hearth, filling the space with blessed heat. They laid her on the old leather sofa, positioning her so the warmth could reach her without burning. Colt dragged a chair over and sat down, preparing for a long vigil. Nora brought him coffee, strong and black the way he liked it, and a plate of beans and cornbread that he ate without tasting. Maria brought more blankets, more heated stones, and then retreated to her room after her mother's gentle urging. "You should rest too," Nora told Colt. "I'll watch her." "I'm fine." "You've been out in that storm for hours. You're half frozen yourself, and stubborn as..." I said I'm fine, Colt repeated, his tone leaving no room for argument. Nora sighed but didn't push further. She knew him well enough to recognize when his mind was set. I'll be in my room if you need me. Wake me if anything changes. I will. After she left, the house fell into a deep quiet, broken only by the crackle of the fire and the moan of the wind outside. Colt sat in his chair watching the woman breathe and tried to imagine what had brought her to this moment. A stagecoach accident, most likely. There'd been no other signs of a struggle on her body, and she'd been heading roughly northeast when he found her, toward where the main road ran. Which meant there were probably others. Dead, if they'd been out in that storm as long as she had. He'd have to go looking come first light. If there were bodies, they deserved a proper burial. And if, by some miracle, there were survivors. But deep down, Colt didn't think there would be. This woman, whoever she was, had used up all the luck available that night. Hours passed, the fire burned low, and Colt added more wood. The wind gradually died down, and through the window he could see the snow had stopped falling. The storm was moving on, leaving behind a landscape transformed into an alien world of white. It was near dawn when she stirred. It started with just a twitch of her fingers, so slight he almost missed it. Then her eyelids fluttered, her breathing changed, becoming faster, more agitated. She made a small sound, not quite a word, but close. Colt leaned forward. Ma'am, can you hear me? Her eyes opened. They were brown, he saw, a deep, warm brown that seemed too alive for someone who'd been so close to death. For a moment they stared at nothing, unfocused and confused. Then they found him, and he saw awareness flood back. Where? She whispered, her voice barely audible. Where am I? You're safe, Colt said quietly, keeping his voice gentle despite the urgency he felt. You're at my ranch, about 20 miles west of Cheyenne. I found you in the snow. She tried to sit up, then gasped at the pain. Every muscle in her body would be screaming right now, Colt knew. Frostbite hurt like hell as it thawed. Easy, he cautioned, putting a hand on her shoulder to keep her from rising. Don't move too fast, you've been through an ordeal. The stage, she breathed, and suddenly her eyes were wide with horror. Oh God, the stage. There was a crash. The horses, they spooked. There was ice on the road. How many? Colt asked. How many people on the stage? 6, she said, tears starting to stream down her face. 6, including the driver, Mrs. Patterson. She was sitting next to me. There was a banker and a young couple going to visit family, and her voice broke. Are they alive? Did anyone else? Colt's silence was answer enough. No, she whispered. No, no, no. She covered her face with her hands, her whole body shaking with sobs. This is my fault. I convinced Mrs. Patterson to take this stage. She wanted to wait for better weather, but I said I couldn't delay. I said, Stop. Colt's voice was firm. This isn't your fault. Stages crash. It happens, especially in winter. You didn't make those horses spook. You didn't put ice on that road. And beating yourself up about it won't bring them back. She looked at him through her tears, and he saw the guilt and grief warring in her expression. But she also saw something else, a recognition, perhaps, that he'd been where she was now, that he knew what it felt like to survive when others didn't. What's your name? He asked. She drew a shaky breath, trying to compose herself. Evelyn. Evelyn Hart. Miss Hart. Evelyn, she interrupted. Just Evelyn. After tonight, formality seems absurd. He nodded. Evelyn, I'm Colt Bennett. This is my ranch. You're going to stay here until you're well enough to travel. That might be a few days, might be a week, but you're safe here. You have my word. Why? She asked suddenly. Why did you come looking? Why didn't you just stay safe in your house? It was a good question. One Colt had asked himself more than once during that long, cold ride through the storm. Because I knew what dying in the cold feels like, he said finally, and I couldn't let that happen to someone else if I could prevent it. There was a story there. She could see it in his eyes, but she didn't press. Instead, she just nodded and whispered, Thank you. No need for thanks, Colt said, echoing words that had been spoken to him once, long ago. Just rest now. Morning's coming, and with it, a lot of decisions. But tonight, just rest. Her eyes were already drifting closed again, exhaustion claiming her. Within moments, she was asleep, a real sleep this time, not the unconscious near-death state she'd been in before. Colt remained in his chair, watching over her as the first gray light of dawn began to creep through the windows. Outside, the world was silent and still, blanketed in snow. Inside, two strangers had been thrown together by chance and storm and fate. Neither of them knew it yet, but this was only the beginning. The sun rose over a world remade by snow, transforming the harsh Wyoming landscape into something almost beautiful. Colt stood at the window of his ranch house, coffee cup in hand, watching the light paint pink and gold across the endless white. He'd been awake all night, keeping vigil over the woman sleeping by his fire, and exhaustion pulled at his bones. But there was work to be done, and work didn't wait for a man to catch his rest. Behind him, Evelyn Hart stirred on the sofa, making a small sound of pain as her battered body protested movement. Colt turned to find her eyes open, confusion flickering across her face before memory crashed back. He saw the moment it hit her, the accident, the deaths, the desperate flight through the storm. Her face crumpled and fresh tears traced paths down her cheeks. "It wasn't a dream," she whispered. "No, ma'am," Colt said quietly. "I'm afraid it wasn't." She closed her eyes for a long moment, her jaw working as she fought for composure. When she opened them again, they were red-rimmed but determined. "The others, you said I was the only one." "I didn't say that exactly. I said my silence was answer enough." Colt set down his coffee cup and moved closer, keeping his voice gentle. "Truth is, I don't know for certain. Storm was too fierce last night to go looking, but I'm heading out this morning to find the wreck. If there are survivors, I'll bring them back. If there aren't—" He paused. "Well, they deserve better than being left out there." Evelyn tried to sit up, gasping as pain lanced through her limbs. Colt moved quickly, slipping an arm behind her shoulders to support her weight. Her skin was warmer now, he noted with relief, though she still trembled like a newborn colt. "I need to come with you," she said. "I need to see—" "You need to stay right here," Colt interrupted firmly. "You've got frostbite on your hands and feet, a concussion from that gash on your head, and you spent half the night closer to dead than alive. You're not going anywhere for at least a few days. But no buts. You want to help them? Then stay here, get stronger, and live." That's what they'd want, if they could want anything. The bluntness of his words made her flinch, but she didn't argue further. Instead, she looked down at her hands, seeing for the first time the bandages wrapped around her fingers, the mottled discoloration of frostbite on her exposed skin. "Will I lose them?" she asked quietly. "My fingers?" "Nora doesn't think so. Says you got lucky, if you can call any part of last night lucky. The damage isn't as deep as it could be. You'll hurt like hell for a while, and you might lose a nail or two, but you should keep your digits." He hesitated, then added, "You were smart to keep moving. A lot of folks would have stopped, tried to wait out the storm. That would have killed you for certain." Evelyn looked up at him, studying his face with an intensity that made him uncomfortable. "You know what it's like," she said. It wasn't a question. "Losing people. That's why you understand." Colt pulled away, putting distance between them. "Everyone loses people, Miss Hart. That's just life." "Evelyn," she corrected automatically, "and there's losing people, and then there's losing people. The way that changes you, hollows you out." Her voice was soft but certain. "You've been hollowed out, Mr. Bennett. I can see it in your eyes." For a long moment, Colt said nothing. The observation was too accurate, too sharp, and it unsettled him that this stranger could read him so clearly. Most people looked at him and saw a hard man, a distant man, someone best left alone. They didn't see the wound beneath, still raw after 3 years. "My wife died," he said finally, the words rough. 3 winters back. Fever took her in 4 days. She was 26 years old. He turned back to the window, unable to face Evelyn's sympathetic gaze. "After that, I figured the world had taken enough from me. I stopped caring much about anything except keeping this ranch running and getting through each day. Then last night, I found you and I—" He stopped, uncertain how to finish. "You remembered what it feels like to save something," Evelyn finished for him. "To fight death and win." "Maybe," Colt admitted. Or maybe I just couldn't stand the thought of one more person dying on my watch. Before Evelyn could respond, the kitchen door swung open and Nora appeared, carrying a tray laden with food. The older woman's eyes widened when she saw Evelyn sitting up. "Dios mío, you should be lying down," she scolded, hurrying over. "Colt, why didn't you—" "Tried," Colt said dryly. "She's stubborn." "I'm fine," Evelyn protested, though her pale face and shaking hands suggested otherwise. "Really, I just— Oh." Her words cut off as her stomach growled loudly, betraying her hunger. Nora's stern expression softened into something almost motherly. "When did you last eat, child?" "Yesterday morning, I think, before we left Fort Collins." Evelyn's brow furrowed as she tried to remember. "There was supposed to be a meal stop at Laramie Station, but we never made it." "Then you'll eat now," Nora declared, setting the tray on the low table beside the sofa. "Slowly, mind. Your stomach's been empty too long for heavy food, so I've brought you broth and bread. Tomorrow, if you keep it down, we'll try something more substantial." The smell of the beef broth made Evelyn's mouth water. She reached for the bowl with bandaged hands, fumbling with the spoon. After the third attempt to lift it to her lips ended with broth sloshing over the rim, Colt stepped forward and took the bowl from her. "Let me," he said gruffly, kneeling beside the sofa. Evelyn's cheeks flushed pink. "I can feed myself." "Sure you can. But you can also let someone help you, which is the smarter choice given your hands won't cooperate just yet." He dipped the spoon into the broth and held it out. "Pride's fine in its place, but this isn't that place." For a moment he thought she'd refuse. Then, with obvious reluctance, she leaned forward and sipped from the spoon. The broth was rich and savory, seasoned with herbs and salt, and she nearly groaned at how good it tasted. Colt fed her slowly, patiently, while Nora watched with approval. "You're good at this," Evelyn observed between sips. "Have you done this before?" "Had to feed my wife toward the end," Colt said simply. "Fever made her too weak to hold a spoon." The words hung in the air, heavy with old grief. Evelyn's eyes filled with tears again, but she blinked them back. "I'm sorry. That must have been terrible." It was. Colt didn't elaborate, just continued feeding her until the bowl was empty. "Now rest. I've got to ride out before the day gets any later." "You'll be careful?" The words came out before Evelyn could stop them, surprising them both. She barely knew this man, yet the thought of him heading back out into that frozen wilderness made her chest tight with anxiety. Colt's expression softened slightly. "Always am. Besides, storms passed. The danger now is just cold and distance, and I know how to handle both." He stood, setting the empty bowl aside. "Nora will look after you. You need anything, you ask her. Understood?" Evelyn nodded, suddenly exhausted again. The brief meal had taken more out of her than she wanted to admit. As Colt headed toward the door, pulling on his heavy coat and checking his rifle, she called out, "Mr. Bennett?" He paused, looking back. "Thank you," she said quietly. "For everything, for finding me, for bringing me here, for—" She gestured helplessly. "For giving me a reason to keep fighting." Something flickers in Colt's gray eyes, surprise, maybe, or recognition. "You gave yourself that reason, Miss Hart. I just showed you where shelter was." Then he was gone, the door closing behind him with a soft thud. Nora tutted softly, adjusting the blankets around Evelyn's shoulders. "That man. Always has to have the last word. Gets it from his father, I think, though I never met the old devil." "How long have you worked for him?" Evelyn asked, grateful for the distraction from her dark thoughts. 8 years now. I came here with my husband, Jose, and our daughter, Maria. You'll meet her later. She's shy around strangers. Jose worked the ranch, and I kept the house." Nora's voice softened. "He passed 5 years ago. Thrown from a horse, broke his neck. Colt let us stay on, even though he didn't really need a housekeeper for just himself. Said this was our home, and death didn't change that." "He sounds like a good man." "He is. Hard sometimes, and too quiet for his own good, but good down to the bone." Nora smoothed the blankets with work-worn hands. His wife, Sarah, she was something special, bright and warm, full of laughter. When she died, the light went out of him. He's been just existing, ever since, until last night. Evelyn understood what Nora wasn't quite saying. You think finding me changed something. I think saving you reminded him what it feels like to matter, to make a difference. Nora met her eyes steadily. Whatever happens next, child, don't take that lightly. You're the first thing he's fought for in 3 years. The weight of that responsibility settled over Evelyn like a physical thing. She wanted to protest that she hadn't asked for this, hadn't asked to be saved or to become some kind of symbol for a grieving widower's redemption. But the words died unspoken because she knew they'd be a lie. She had asked for this, in her desperate prayer in the snow, in her refusal to surrender to the cold. She'd asked, and Colt Bennett had answered. Now she owed him her life, and that was a debt that couldn't be easily repaid. The morning passed slowly. Nora insisted Evelyn rest, and though she wanted to argue, exhaustion made compliance easy. She drifted in and out of sleep, waking occasionally to find Nora or Maria sitting nearby with mending or knitting, keeping quiet vigil. Each time they'd offer her water or broth, help her to the chamber pot despite her mortification, and tuck her back into the blankets with gentle efficiency. In her dreams, Evelyn relived the crash over and over. The sudden lurch of the stage as the horses panicked, Mrs. Patterson's scream, the sickening crunch of wood and bone, the terrible silence that followed. Each time she woke with her heart pounding and tears on her face, and each time Nora was there with soothing words and cool cloths for her forehead. "Hush now, you're safe," the older woman murmured. "Whatever you're seeing, it's not here. You're safe." But Evelyn didn't feel safe. She felt like she was balancing on a knife's edge between the life she'd known and something entirely unknown. Everything familiar had been stripped away in that storm. Her belongings, her companions, even the future she'd been dreading. Theodore and his cold eyes. The wedding she didn't want. The cage of society expectations. All of it felt distant now, like it had happened to someone else. Maybe it had. Maybe that Evelyn Hart, the dutiful niece, the obedient fiancée, the proper Boston lady, had died in the snow. And this woman, whoever she was now, was someone new, someone who'd been hollowed out by death and might, just possibly, have room to be filled with something better. It was late afternoon when the sound of horse hooves crunching through snow brought Evelyn fully awake. She pushed herself upright despite Nora's protests, her heart hammering as she strained to hear. Was it Colt? Had he found survivors? Or worse, had something happened to him out there? The door opened, bringing a blast of cold air and snow, and Colt stepped through. He looked exhausted, his face gray with cold and his eyes shadowed. Behind him, Evelyn could see his horse, Thor, laden with bundles wrapped in canvas. Bodies. He'd brought back bodies. Nora crossed herself. "How many?" "5," Colt said heavily, pulling off his gloves. His hands were red and raw despite the leather. "Driver, 3 passengers, and 1 more I think was the shotgun guard. Found them in and around the wreck about 4 miles southeast. Stage went off the road at a bad turn, rolled down an embankment. They never had a chance." Evelyn felt the tears come again, hot and bitter. 5 people. 5 lives ended in a moment of panic and ice. "Mrs. Patterson?" she whispered. Colt's expression was gentle. "If she was the older woman in the gray cloak, yes. She's among them. It would have been quick, Miss Hart. She wouldn't have suffered." It was a kindness, that lie. Evelyn knew it was a lie. Mrs. Patterson had lived long enough to cry out, but she accepted it anyway because the alternative was unbearable. "What will you do with them?" "Ground's too frozen for burial just now. I'll keep them in the barn until spring thaw, then we'll give them proper graves in the cemetery at Redemption Creek. The town's small, but they have a preacher. He'll say the words." Colt moved to the fire, holding his hands out to the warmth. "I found some personal effects. Papers mostly. One of the men was carrying a ledger with names and addresses. I'll write to their families once the roads are clear." "I can help with that," Evelyn offered. "I knew Mrs. Patterson. She spoke of her daughter in Cheyenne, and the young couple. They mentioned visiting family in Laramie." Colt nodded slowly. "Appreciate that. Hard letters to write." "I know." And she did. She'd written to her father's business partners after he died, each letter a fresh cut on her heart. "Mr. Bennett, did you find, was there luggage, personal belongings?" "Some. Most of it scattered or damaged. Why?" Evelyn looked down at herself, at the borrowed nightgown and blankets. Because everything I own, everything I owned, was in my trunk on that stage. My clothes, my money, the letters from my uncle. Her voice wavered. I have nothing left. Just this body, and it barely works. The reality of her situation hit her fully for the first time. She was stranded hundreds of miles from her uncle, with no money, no proper clothing, and injuries that made travel impossible. She was dependent entirely on the charity of strangers, and while Colt and Nora seemed kind, how long would that kindness last? A few days? A week? What then? We'll figure it out, Colt said, his voice firm. First thing is getting you well. After that, we'll worry about the rest. But I can't pay you, Evelyn protested. I can't repay your kindness or even cover the cost of my food and shelter. My uncle, he has money. He'll compensate you once I reach him, but stop. Colt held up a hand. I don't want payment. You think I pulled you out of that snow expecting to be paid? This isn't the East, Miss Hart. Out here, we help folks because it's the right thing to do, not because there's profit in it. That's not fair to you. Life's not fair, Colt said bluntly. You of all people should know that by now. But we do what we can to make it bearable. You're here, you're hurt, and you need help. That's all that matters. The rest, money, debts, obligations, that's for later. For now, you heal. Evelyn wanted to argue further, but exhaustion and pain made it impossible. Instead, she just nodded, accepting his charity even as it galled her proud Boston upbringing. She'd been raised to be self-sufficient, to never be a burden. Now she was nothing but. Maria appeared from the kitchen carrying a fresh pot of coffee and some cornbread still warm from the oven. She was a pretty girl with long dark hair and shy eyes that darted away whenever Evelyn tried to meet them. She set the food on the table, whispered something to her mother in Spanish, and fled back to the kitchen. She's nervous around strangers, Nora explained, pouring coffee for Colt. Give her time. She has beautiful eyes, Evelyn said, like her mother's. Nora smiled, pleased. Her father's actually. Jose had eyes like a deer, all soft and gentle. Maria got those. Everything else is pure Alvarez stubbornness. The evening settled over the ranch house like a comfortable blanket. Colt sat in his chair by the fire, saying little but present. Nora moved between kitchen and hearth, preparing supper and clucking over both her patients, Colt for his frozen hands, Evelyn for her persistent shivers. Maria appeared occasionally, always quiet, always quick to retreat. They ate together at sunset, simple ranch food that tasted like heaven to Evelyn's starved palate. Beans and cornbread and thick slices of bacon washed down with bitter coffee sweetened with honey. Colt ate mechanically, his thoughts clearly elsewhere. When Nora pressed him about the wreck, he described it in careful clinical detail. The angle of the overturned stage, the way the horses had broken free of their traces and likely run until they dropped, the personal effects he'd salvaged. I found this, he said, pulling something from his pocket. It was a small leather case, water-stained but intact. He handed it to Evelyn. It was in what I think was your trunk. Seemed important. Evelyn opened the case with shaking hands. Inside was a daguerreotype, her father, taken the year before he died. He stared out at her with the same serious expression he'd worn in life, his eyes intelligent and kind. Seeing his face again broke something loose in her chest, and she began to cry in earnest, great heaving sobs that hurt her bruised ribs. I'm sorry, she gasped between sobs. I'm sorry, I don't mean to. He was all I had, and now he's gone, and everyone's gone, and I don't know what to do. Nora was there immediately, wrapping Evelyn in a firm embrace that smelled of flour and wood smoke. Let it out, child. You've earned these tears. Colt shifted uncomfortably in his chair, unused to such displays of emotion. But he didn't leave, didn't turn away. He just sat there, bearing witness to her grief, understanding in a way few could that sometimes the only thing to do with pain was let it pour out until the well ran dry. Eventually, Evelyn's sobs subsided into hiccups and sniffles. She pulled away from Nora, embarrassed by her breakdown. I'm sorry, that was unseemly. That was human, Colt corrected. Nothing unseemly about grief. In Boston, young ladies don't cry in public, Evelyn said, trying to muster some of her old composure. It's considered a sign of weak character. Well, this isn't Boston, Colt said, and anyone who thinks tears are weakness has never had cause to shed them. The strongest people I know are the ones who've cried until they had nothing left, then got up the next day and kept going. Evelyn looked at him curiously. Is that what you did? After your wife died? For a long moment she thought he wouldn't answer. Then he said quietly, No. After Sarah died, I cried myself sick for a week, then locked those feelings away where they couldn't touch me. Thought I was being strong. Turns out, I was just being a coward. You're not a coward, Evelyn said with surprising fierceness. A coward would have stayed inside last night. A coward would have let me die rather than risk himself. Whatever else you are, Mr. Bennett, you're not that. Colt's gray eyes met hers, and something passed between them. Recognition, maybe, or understanding. Two broken people seeing themselves reflected in each other's pain. Maybe, he said finally, or maybe I'm just trying to outrun my ghosts. Either way, you're alive, and that's what counts. The fire crackled, sending sparks up the chimney. Outside, night had fallen fully, and with it came the cold, deep and penetrating, the kind of cold that killed. But inside Colt Bennett's ranch house, there was warmth and light, and for the moment, safety. Evelyn settled back into her blankets, clutching her father's picture to her chest. She was exhausted, hurting, and adrift in a world she didn't understand. But she was alive. And somehow, in this rough house with these kind strangers, she felt more at home than she had in months of living under her uncle's roof in preparation for a wedding she dreaded. Tell me about your wife, she said suddenly. If it's not too painful, I'd like to know about her. Colt was quiet for so long that Evelyn thought he'd refuse. Then he began to speak, his voice low and rough with memory. Sarah was a school teacher, came out from Ohio to teach at the Redemption Creek School. She had red hair, really red like copper wire, and freckles she hated but I loved. She laughed at everything, bad jokes, good jokes, horses stepping in mud puddles. Everything was cause for joy with her. He stared into the fire, seeing something far away. She made me want to be better, kinder, more patient. When she died, it felt like someone had reached into my chest and pulled out everything worth keeping. How did you meet? Evelyn asked softly. Horse auction. She was looking to buy a gentle mare for riding to school. I was selling off some stock. She walked right up to me, this tiny woman who barely came to my shoulder, and told me she needed a horse that wouldn't try to kill her because she'd never ridden before but was determined to learn. He smiled slightly at the memory. I sold her the gentlest mare I had and offered to teach her to ride for free. She said she'd accept only if I'd let her teach me to read better in exchange. That's how it started. She sounds wonderful, Evelyn said. She was. Colt's voice went rough. And then she wasn't there anymore, and I didn't know how to be in a world without her. Still don't, most days. Nora spoke up from her corner, where she'd been quietly knitting. But you're learning. Slowly, but learning. Tonight is the most I've heard you talk about Sarah in 2 years. Colt looked startled, as if he hadn't realized he'd opened up so much. He cleared his throat, shifting uncomfortably. Yeah, well, guess having someone new around changes things. Evelyn felt the weight of that statement. She was the catalyst for this change, whether she wanted to be or not. The stranger who'd stumbled into Colt Bennett's carefully controlled grief and cracked it open just by needing to be saved. She should say something meaningful, something comforting. But exhaustion was pulling at her again, making her thoughts muzzy and her eyes heavy. Thank you for telling me, she managed, about Sarah and about everything. Rest now, Colt said, his voice gentle. Morning comes early on a ranch, and you need your strength. Will you? Evelyn hesitated, feeling foolish but unable to stop the words. Will you stay? Just until I fall asleep? I keep seeing the crash when I close my eyes, and I'll stay, Colt interrupted. Long as you need. It was the kindness in his voice that undid her. This hard, grieving man who could have turned away, could have let her die in the snow, was instead sitting vigil at her bedside like she mattered, like her life had value beyond her usefulness to others. In Boston, she'd been a pawn in her uncle's social games, a decorative piece to be married off to Theodore Blackwood's money and connections. Her opinions hadn't mattered, her dreams hadn't mattered. She'd been drowning slowly in silk and society expectations, and the stage crash that killed 5 people had, paradoxically, saved her from that fate. The guilt of that thought made her stomach churn. 5 people dead, and here she was finding silver linings in the tragedy. What kind of person did that make her? "Stop thinking so loud," Colt said dryly. "I can hear your guilt from here." Evelyn's eyes flew open. "How did you—" "Because I wore that same expression for months after Sarah died. Guilt that I was alive and she wasn't. Guilt that some part of me, way down deep, was almost relieved because at least the waiting was over." He leaned forward, his elbows on his knees. "You want my advice? Feel the guilt. Sit with it. Then let it go, because it won't change anything. Those folks died in that crash. That's a tragedy. But you lived. That's not something to feel guilty about. That's something to honor by making your survival worth their sacrifice." "I don't know how to do that," Evelyn whispered. "Nobody does it first. You figure it out as you go." Colt stood, stretching his long frame. "For now, you survive another day. Then another. Eventually those days add up to something worth calling a life." He moved to the window, looking out at the star-filled night. The moon had risen, nearly full, painting the snow in shades of silver and blue, beautiful and deadly, like so much in this wild land. "My uncle will be worried," Evelyn said, breaking the silence. "The stage was due in Cheyenne yesterday. By now, he'll know something went wrong. We'll get word to him soon as we can. The mail rider comes through Redemption Creek once a week. Next run is in 3 days. I'll write to the station master in Cheyenne. Let him know you're alive and safe." "Thank you." Evelyn paused, then asked the question that had been nagging at her. "What if he demands I come immediately?" "I know you said I need to heal, but if my uncle insists—" "Then he insists," Colt said flatly. "But you're not traveling until I say you're fit for it, and I don't care if he's the governor himself. You push too hard too soon, and those frostbite wounds could turn bad. You could lose fingers or toes or worse, so he can wait or he can come here himself. Those are the options." The firmness in his voice brooked no argument. Evelyn found herself oddly comforted by his stubbornness. In her world, men bowed to social pressure and propriety. Here, Colt Bennett answered only to his own code of right and wrong. It was foreign to her, but also refreshing. "He won't like it," she warned. "Don't much care what he likes. I care about doing what's right for you." And there it was again, that casual assertion that her well-being mattered more than convenience or social expectation. Evelyn felt tears prick her eyes again, but this time they weren't from grief. They were from the overwhelming relief of being seen, truly seen, as a person rather than an obligation. "I should sleep," she said, her voice thick. "You're right. Morning comes early, and I'm so tired I can barely think." "Then sleep," Colt said. "I'll be right here." This time, when Evelyn closed her eyes, the nightmares stayed at bay. Instead, she dreamed of fire and warmth, of calloused hands pulling her from darkness, and of gray eyes that had seen too much loss but still held room for compassion. She dreamed of a voice saying, "You'll make it home with me." And for the first time since her father died, home felt like something more than just a place on a map. It felt like a promise she might actually want to keep. The days that followed took on a rhythm as steady and inevitable as the turn of seasons. Evelyn woke each morning to the sound of Colt moving through the house, stoking fires and preparing for the day's work. She'd lie still in her cocoon of blankets, listening to the quiet sounds of ranch life beginning, boots on wood floors, the creak of the front door, Thor's welcoming whinny from the barn. Then Nora would appear with breakfast and gentle hands to help her wash and dress in borrowed clothes that hung loose on her thin frame. The pain was constant those first days, a dull ache that sharpened to agony whenever she moved too quickly or asked too much of her damaged body. Her fingers and toes throbbed as circulation returned, the frostbite leaving them hypersensitive to even the softest touch. The cut on her forehead healed slowly, itching beneath Nora's careful bandaging. But worse than the physical pain was the exhaustion that pinned her to the sofa like a butterfly to board, making even the simplest tasks feel insurmountable. "This is normal," Nora assured her on the third morning, when Evelyn broke down crying from frustration at being unable to hold a teacup steady. "Your body fought death and won. It needs time to remember how to do all the little things you took for granted before." "I hate being helpless," Evelyn said, wiping angrily at her tears. I hate needing help with everything. In Boston, I could at least pretend I had some control over my life. Now I can't even dress myself without assistance. Nora's expression softened with understanding. Control is a pretty illusion, child. Life comes at us whether we're ready or not. The strong ones aren't those who never fall. They're the ones who get back up after. She pressed a fresh cup of tea into Evelyn's bandaged hands, steadying them with her own. You'll get there. Give yourself grace. But grace was hard to summon when every hour reinforced her dependence. Maria brought her meals on trays, too shy to do more than smile tremulously before retreating. Nora helped her to the washroom, supported her weight when her legs shook too badly to stand alone, changed her bandages with efficient gentleness. And Colt was a constant presence even in his absence, his consideration evident in the extra wood he stacked by the fire, the books he left on the table within her reach, the way he'd carved small grips into a wooden spoon so her clumsy fingers could hold it better. He spoke little during those days, his natural reticence reasserting itself now that the crisis had passed. But he was always there in the evenings, settling into his chair across from her while Nora cooked supper and Maria did her schoolwork at the kitchen table. Sometimes he'd read, his lips moving slightly over the words in a way that suggested Sarah's reading lessons had been necessary. Sometimes he'd work on tack that needed mending, his strong hands moving with practiced efficiency. And sometimes he'd just sit and stare into the fire, his thoughts far away in that country of grief where Evelyn couldn't follow. It was on the fourth evening that she finally broke the comfortable silence between them. Tell me about the ranch, she said, watching firelight play across his weathered features. How long have you been here? Colt looked up from the bridle he was oiling, surprised by the question. 12 years. Bought the land with money I'd saved from 5 years of cowboying for other men's outfits. Started with nothing but a tent, 50 head of cattle, and more ambition than sense. That sounds terrifying. It was, he admitted. First winter nearly killed me. Lost half my stock to cold and wolves, and came close to losing myself when my provisions ran low. If an old trapper named Dutch hadn't found me half-starved in February, I wouldn't be here now. He set down the bridle, his hands stilling. Dutch stayed through till spring, taught me everything he knew about surviving out here. Then he moved on, way trappers do. Never saw him again, but I owe him my life. Evelyn heard the echo of her own story in his words. Another stranger saved, another debt that couldn't be repaid. Do you think that's why you came looking for me? Because someone once did the same for you? Maybe. Or maybe it's just what decent people do, help when they can, because someday they might be the ones who need helping. Colt picked up the bridle again, his fingers working oil into the leather. Either way, it's not a debt you owe. It's a cycle. Someone helped me. I helped you. Someday you'll help someone else. That's how we survive out here, by taking care of each other. That's not how it works in Boston, Evelyn said quietly. In Boston, everything is a transaction. Every favor comes with strings attached. If someone helps you, it's because they want something in return. Status, connections, leverage. Genuine kindness is so rare, it's suspect. Colt shook his head slowly. That's a hard way to live. It is, Evelyn agreed, but it's all I've ever known. My father understood the game and played it well enough to build a modest fortune. After he died, my uncle took control of everything. My inheritance, my future, me. He arranged my engagement to Theodore because it would benefit his business interests. My feelings about it were irrelevant. You didn't want to marry this Theodore? I didn't want to marry anyone, Evelyn said, the words tumbling out in a rush she couldn't stop. I wanted to go to university, to study literature and philosophy. I wanted to write, to travel, to make my own choices. But Uncle Henry said those were foolish dreams, that my duty was to marry well and produce heirs to carry on the family name. Theodore was rich, influential, and willing to overlook my unfortunate independent streak as long as I learned to be properly obedient. She laughed bitterly. The stage crash that killed 5 people also saved me from that fate. What does that make me? Human, Colt said simply. You can mourn those who died and still be grateful you didn't have to sacrifice yourself to a life you didn't want. Those aren't contradictory feelings. They're just complicated ones. Before Evelyn could respond, Nora called from the kitchen that supper was ready. The meal was hearty ranch fare, venison stew thick with vegetables, fresh bread still warm from the oven, and apple pie that Maria had made under her mother's supervision. They ate together at the rough-hewn table, a makeshift family bound by circumstance rather than blood. Maria was gradually warming to Evelyn's presence, no longer fleeing the moment their eyes met. Tonight she even spoke directly to her, asking in softly accented English if the pie was to her liking. "It's delicious," Evelyn assured her. "The best I've ever tasted." Maria's face lit up with shy pleasure. "Mama taught me her mother's recipe, from Mexico, before they came north." "Your grandmother must have been a wonderful cook." "She was," Nora confirmed, pride evident in her voice. "Maria has her gift for baking. Everything else she got from her father, his gentleness, his way with animals, his kind heart." "I wish I could have known him," Evelyn said. "He would have liked you," Nora replied. "Jose had a soft spot for strays and lost things. He'd have taken one look at you, half frozen and heartbroken, and adopted you on the spot." She glanced at Colt with meaning. "Some men are like that. Can't stand to see suffering without trying to fix it." Colt shifted uncomfortably under her knowing gaze. "Anyone would have done the same." "But you're the one who did," Evelyn said softly. "That matters." After supper, while Nora and Maria cleaned up, Colt retreated to his chair and pulled out a writing kit. He spent the next hour composing careful letters in handwriting that showed the effort each word required. When Evelyn asked what he was writing, he explained he was notifying the families of the stage crash victims, as well as sending word to her uncle that she was alive and recovering. "What did you tell him?" Evelyn asked, anxiety tightening her chest. "My uncle, I mean." "The truth. That you were in a stage accident, 5 others died, and you're currently recovering at my ranch. That you'll travel to Cheyenne when you're well enough, but not before. And that he can write back through the Redemption Creek post office if he needs to reach you. He'll be furious that I'm staying with a single man unchaperoned. In his world, my reputation is already ruined." Colt's expression hardened. "In his world, maybe, but his world isn't here. Out here, survival matters more than reputation. If he's got a problem with that, he can take it up with me." The protective edge in his voice sent an unfamiliar warmth through Evelyn's chest. No one had defended her so fiercely since her father died. Theodore certainly never had. He'd been quick to criticize any behavior that didn't conform to his exacting standards, always reminding her that she should be grateful he'd agreed to marry a woman with her unfortunate tendency toward independence. "Thank you," she said, "for standing between me and his judgment." "Nothing to thank me for. It's just basic decency." But it wasn't, and they both knew it. Basic decency was rare enough to be precious, especially when it came without expectation of return. The evening wore on. Maria excused herself to bed, and Nora followed soon after, leaving Evelyn and Colt alone by the dying fire. The silence between them was comfortable now, no longer weighted with the awkwardness of strangers forced together by crisis. They'd settled into an unspoken understanding, a recognition that they were both damaged in different ways, and that sometimes the best thing one broken person could offer another was simply presence without pressure. "Can I ask you something?" Evelyn said eventually, watching shadows dance on the walls. "What made you go out in that storm? You said you were checking fence lines, but that seems dangerous in a blizzard." Colt was quiet for a long moment. When he spoke, his voice was distant, remembering. "It was stupid, really. But there's this stretch of fence on the eastern border that always seems to break in winter. If the cattle get through there, they can wander onto Henderson's land, and that old bastard shoots first and asks questions later. So I check it before every major storm, make sure it's secure." He paused. "Sarah used to scold me for it, said no fence was worth dying over. She was right, but I'm too stubborn to admit it even now." "Your wife sounds like she was very wise." "She was. Wiser than me by half, and she never let me forget it." There was affection in his voice now, nostalgia without the sharp edge of pain that usually accompanied mentions of Sarah. "She'd laugh herself sick if she could see me now playing nursemaid to a Boston socialite who can't hold a spoon steady." "I'm not a socialite," Evelyn protested, though there was no heat in it. "I'm just a woman who happened to be born into a certain class." "What would you be if you could choose?" Colt asked, genuine curiosity in his tone. "You said you wanted to study and write. What would you write about?" No one had ever asked her that before. Not her father, not her uncle, certainly not Theodore. The question opened something in her chest, releasing words she'd kept locked away for years. "I'd write about real people," she said, the words coming faster now. "Not the sanitized versions we see in parlor novels, but the messy, complicated truth of human experience. I'd write about women who don't fit the mold society tries to force them into, about the price of conformity and the courage it takes to choose a different path." She looked down at her bandaged hands. "I'd write about survival, I think, about what it costs and what it's worth." "That sounds like something worth reading," Colt said. "You should do it." "Just like that? I should just write?" "Why not? You've got time now while you're healing. Paper and ink aren't hard to come by. And from what I've heard, near-death experiences give people perspective worth sharing." He stood, moving to a shelf in the corner. After a moment of searching, he returned with a leather journal and a fountain pen. This was Sarah's. She kept a diary, wrote in it every day. After she died, I couldn't bring myself to read it. Felt like violating something sacred. But it's just been gathering dust for 3 years, and I think she'd rather it be used than wasted. Evelyn took the journal with trembling hands. The leather was soft, well-worn, the pages yellowed but pristine. On the inside cover, written in an elegant script, were the words, "Sarah Bennett, her book, 1874. "I can't take this," Evelyn whispered. "It was your wife's. It was hers. Now it's yours if you want it." Sarah believed in living fully, in not letting fear hold you back. If she were here, she'd tell you to stop making excuses and start writing. Colt's expression softened. "Consider it a loan if that makes you feel better. When you leave for Cheyenne, you can take it with you and send it back when you've filled it up with your stories." Evelyn clutched the journal to her chest, overwhelmed by the gesture. This wasn't just paper and leather, it was trust, given freely by a man who had every reason to guard his heart against further loss. It was an invitation to stay, to heal, to become part of something larger than her own survival. "I don't know what to say," she managed. "Don't say anything, just write. Or don't. The choice is yours." That night, after Colt had banked the fire and retreated to his own room, Evelyn opened the journal. Sarah's diary entries filled perhaps a quarter of the pages, ending abruptly in mid-sentence with the words, "Today, Colt brought me wildflowers from the high meadow, and I thought my heart would burst from—" The sentence went unfinished, interrupted by fever and death. Evelyn carefully turned to a blank page, hesitating with pen poised over paper. What did she have to say? What story could she tell that would honor both the blank pages before her and the woman whose book this had been? She began to write. "My name is Evelyn Hart, and 5 days ago, I should have died in the snow. That I'm alive to write these words is due entirely to the courage of a stranger named Colt Bennett, who rode out into a killing storm and refused to let death claim me. I don't know yet what I'm supposed to do with this second chance at life, or how to carry the weight of surviving when 5 others didn't, but I'm determined to figure it out. If nothing else, I owe it to the dead to make my survival mean something. I've spent 23 years being told who I should be, how I should act, what I should want. I've been molded and shaped like clay on a potter's wheel, formed into something decorative but hollow. The stage crash shattered that carefully constructed shell, and now I'm left with the question of who Evelyn Hart actually is when no one is watching, when reputation and propriety and social expectation are stripped away. I don't have an answer yet, but for the first time in my life, I have the space to look for one." The words flowed easier than she expected, filling page after page with observations and reflections and questions she'd never dared voice aloud. She wrote about her father's death and her uncle's control, about Theodore's cold eyes and the cage of silk she'd been trapped in. She wrote about the crash with brutal honesty, not sparing herself the guilt or the horror. And she wrote about Colt, his quiet strength, his unexpected gentleness, the way he seemed to carry his own ghosts with a dignity that humbled her. When exhaustion finally claimed her, the fire had burned down to embers and gray dawn light was seeping through the windows. She fell asleep with the journal clutched to her chest and Sarah's pen still in her hand, and for the first time since the crash, she slept deeply and without nightmares. The days began to blur together, in a way that should have been monotonous but somehow wasn't. Each morning brought small improvements, fingers that moved a little easier, legs that held her weight a little longer, pain that dulled from sharp to merely persistent. Nora gradually assigned her small tasks as her hands healed, starting with simple things like folding laundry and progressing to helping with meal preparation. "You're useless in the kitchen," Nora informed her cheerfully, after Evelyn's third attempt at bread resulted in a dense, inedible brick. "But you've got the makings of a decent cook if you stop thinking so much and trust your hands." "In Boston, ladies don't cook," Evelyn said, punching down dough with more force than strictly necessary. "We have servants for that." "And what happens when you don't have servants? You starve?" Nora shook her head. "Out here, everyone needs to pull their weight. Can't afford to be helpless when survival depends on doing for yourself." It was a philosophy that permeated every aspect of ranch life, Evelyn was learning. Nothing was wasted, everyone contributed, and the work never truly ended. It just shifted with the seasons and the needs of the moment. Even Maria, at 18, could shoe a horse, treat a sick calf, and shoot well enough to bring down a rabbit for the pot. These were skills Evelyn had never imagined needing, much less possessing. But slowly, painfully, she was learning. Nora taught her to cook and preserve food, to mend clothes and treat minor injuries. Maria showed her how to care for the chickens and gather eggs without getting pecked, how to churn butter and card wool. And Colt, when he wasn't out working the ranch, taught her about the land itself, pointing out landmarks visible from the window and explaining how to read weather in the sky and survival in the behavior of animals. "That's Thor," he said one afternoon, catching her watching his gray gelding through the window. "Best horse I ever owned. Smart as some men and twice as reliable." "He's beautiful," Evelyn said. "I used to ride in Boston. My father kept a stable. Nothing like this, of course, but enough that I learned the basics." Colt's eyebrows rose. "You can ride?" "I could. It's been over a year, though, and I don't know if my hands are strong enough yet to hold reins properly." "Only one way to find out." Colt stood, making a decision. "Come on." "Now, but I'm barely steady on my feet, which is why we're going now, while you're still weak enough to listen to sense instead of pushing too hard." He grabbed her borrowed coat from the hook by the door. "Besides, getting outside will do you good. You've been cooped up in here for over a week. Fresh air and sunshine work better than any medicine Nora can brew." Evelyn wanted to argue, but the prospect of leaving the house, even just to the barn, was too tempting to resist. She let Colt help her into the coat and boots, then leaned on his arm as they navigated the cleared path to the barn. The cold air hit her like a slap, stealing her breath and making her eyes water. But beneath the bite of winter, she could smell pine and snow and something clean and wild that she'd never encountered in the city. The sky arched overhead in a blue so deep and pure it hurt to look at, and the mountains in the distance cut sharp profiles against the horizon. "It's beautiful," she breathed. "It's hard," Colt corrected. "Beautiful, yes, but hard. This land doesn't forgive mistakes, and it doesn't care about your background or your breeding. It'll kill you just as dead whether you're a Boston socialite or a cowboy who should know better." He looked at her seriously. "That's important to understand if you're going to survive out here. The land doesn't play favorites." They reached the barn and Colt helped her inside where it was marginally warmer. Thor greeted them with a friendly whinny, and Evelyn felt her heart lift at the sight of the big gray horse. He was magnificent, well-muscled and intelligent-eyed, with a calm disposition that suggested he'd seen his share of trouble and learned to take it in stride. "Can I touch him?" she asked. "He'd be offended if you didn't." Colt guided her hand to Thor's neck, helping her stroke the warm hide. "Go ahead. Introduce yourself properly." Evelyn felt foolish talking to a horse, but she did it anyway. "Hello, Thor. Thank you for carrying me home through the storm. I know I wasn't light, even half frozen." Thor's ear swiveled toward her voice, and he lowered his head to snuffle at her coat, looking for treats. Colt laughed, a sound Evelyn had never heard from him before, and it transformed his entire face from stern to almost boyish. "He's shameless," Colt said, producing an apple from his pocket and letting Evelyn feed it to the horse. "Thinks everyone exists to spoil him rotten." "He's earned it," Evelyn said, watching Thor crunch the apple with evident satisfaction. "He saved my life. "We both did," Colt said quietly. "But yeah, he's earned it." They stood there in the barn's dusty warmth, surrounded by the smell of hay and horses and leather, and Evelyn felt something shift in her chest. This wasn't Boston. This wasn't the life she'd been raised for or the future she'd imagined. But standing here with her hand on Thor's neck and Colt's solid presence beside her, she felt more real, more present, more herself than she had in years. "I don't want to go back," she said suddenly, the words escaping before she could stop them. "To Cheyenne, to my uncle, to that life. I don't want to go back." Colt was quiet for a long moment. When he spoke, his voice was careful. "What do you want?" It was the same question he'd asked about her writing, but bigger now, more dangerous. What did she want? Not what was expected, not what was proper, but what her heart actually desired when all the social conditioning was stripped away. "I want to stay here," Evelyn admitted, the truth terrifying and liberating in equal measure. "I want to learn to cook properly and write again and write without worrying what anyone thinks. I want to figure out who I am when I'm not trying to fit into someone else's mold." She looked up at Colt, her heart hammering. "I know that's impossible. I know I have responsibilities, and my uncle has expectations, and I can't just disappear into the wilderness like I have no obligations. But for the first time in my life, I know what I want, and it's this life, this place, this—" She trailed off, unable to finish the sentence because she wasn't sure what this was. The ranch? The freedom? The man standing beside her who'd given her back her life and asked nothing in return? Colt's gray eyes searched her face, reading something there she didn't know she was showing. "Nothing's impossible if you want it badly enough," he said finally. "But wanting something and being ready for it aren't the same thing. This life," he gestured around them, "it's hard. Harder than anything you've known. And choosing it means choosing all of it, including the parts that aren't beautiful or romantic, the loneliness and the danger and the endless work. You think you want that now, but give it time. See what you really feel when the novelty wears off and reality sets in." "You think I'm being foolish," Evelyn said, hurt coloring her voice. "I think you're recovering from trauma and maybe not thinking clearly," Colt said bluntly. "I think you're comparing this place to a life you hated, which makes anywhere else look appealing by comparison. And I think you deserve the chance to make choices from a place of strength rather than desperation." His expression softened slightly. "But I also think you're braver than you give yourself credit for, and if you really want this life, you're stubborn enough to make it work." That almost sounded like a compliment. It was. Colt's mouth quirked in something almost like a smile. "But it doesn't change the facts. You've got an uncle in Cheyenne expecting you, a fiancé back east who probably thinks you're dead, and a whole life waiting for you to return to it. You can't just walk away from all that without consequences." "What if I'm willing to face the consequences?" Evelyn challenged. "Then that's your choice to make," Colt said. "But make it for the right reasons. Make it because you want to build something new, not just because you're running away from something old. There's a difference." He was right, and Evelyn knew it. But knowing something intellectually and accepting it emotionally were two different things. She wanted to argue, to insist that she knew her own mind, that she wasn't confused or traumatized or grasping at straws. But the truth was more complicated than that. She was all those things, confused and traumatized and desperately seeking something solid to hold on to in a world that had tilted off its axis. Maybe Colt was right. Maybe she needed time to sort through her feelings, to separate genuine desire from fear-driven impulse. But that didn't make the wanting any less real. "I should get you back inside," Colt said, breaking into her thoughts. "You're shivering, and Nora will have my hide if I let you catch cold on top of everything else." They walked back to the house in silence, Evelyn leaning more heavily on Colt's arm than she had on the way out. The brief excursion had exhausted her more than she wanted to admit, proving Colt's point about her not being ready for ranch life. She could barely walk to the barn and back without her legs turning to jelly. How could she possibly manage the demanding physical labor that kept this place running? But determination was a stubborn thing, and Evelyn had discovered in herself reserves of it she hadn't known existed. If she wanted this life, and she was increasingly certain that she did, then she'd have to earn it, not through breeding or social connections or money, but through sweat and effort and the simple refusal to quit. It was a daunting prospect, but it was also, in its own way, deeply appealing. That night, she wrote in Sarah's journal about her conversation with Colt, trying to untangle her own motivations through the act of putting pen to paper. She wrote about the difference between running away and running toward, about the fear of returning to a life that had never fit, and the equally terrifying prospect of forging a new one. She wrote honestly about her growing feelings for Colt, not romantic necessarily, though there were threads of that too, but something deeper and more complicated. Respect, maybe. Recognition of a kindred spirit. The understanding that comes when two broken people glimpse their own damage reflected in another's eyes. She didn't know where any of this was leading, but for the first time in her life, she was choosing her own path rather than following one laid out by others. And that, she was discovering, made all the difference. 2 weeks after the crash, a rider appeared on the horizon just after dawn. Colt spotted him from the barn where he was forking hay for the horses, and something about the determined way the man rode, straight and purposeful, like he owned the very air, made Colt's jaw tighten. He set down the pitchfork and walked out to meet whoever was coming, his hand resting instinctively on the rifle he kept propped by the door. The rider drew closer, resolving into a well-dressed man in his 50s mounted on an expensive bay gelding that was decidedly unsuited for winter travel. He wore a wool coat that probably cost more than Colt made in 6 months, and his boots were polished to a shine that wouldn't last 10 minutes on a working ranch. Everything about him screamed money and city breeding, and Colt knew without being told that this was Henry Barrett, Evelyn's uncle. "You Bennett?" the man called out, reining in his horse with more force than necessary. The gelding tossed his head in protest. "I am," Colt said, keeping his voice neutral. "And you'd be Mr. Barrett." "Henry Barrett, yes. I've come for my niece." He dismounted stiffly, clearly unused to long rides. "I received your letter. Where is she?" "In the house, recovering. She's doing well, all things considered." "All things considered," Barrett repeated, his tone sharp with accusation. "My niece was supposed to arrive in Cheyenne 2 weeks ago. Instead, I get word that she's been staying unchaperoned with a bachelor rancher in the middle of nowhere. Do you have any idea what this does to her reputation?" Colt felt his temper stir, but kept it leashed. "What it does, Mr. Barrett, is keep her alive. Your niece was half frozen and injured when I found her. Moving her before she was ready could have killed her. I figured you'd prefer her alive and scandalous to dead and proper, but maybe I was wrong about that." Barrett's face flushed red. "How dare you how dare I save her life, or how dare I speak plainly about your priorities?" Colt crossed his arms. "Look, I understand you're upset, but your niece has been through hell. 5 people died in that crash, and she walked through a blizzard that should have killed her too. She needs compassion and time to heal, not lectures about propriety." "What she needs," Barrett said coldly, "is to fulfill her obligations. She has a fiancé waiting in Boston, a wedding to plan, and a future that doesn't involve hiding away on some godforsaken ranch playing at frontier life." The words hung in the frigid air between them. Before Colt could respond, the door to the house opened and Evelyn appeared on the porch, wrapped in one of Nora's shawls. Her face had regained some color over the past 2 weeks, but she still looked fragile, the bandages on her hands stark white against the dark wool. "Uncle Henry," she said, her voice carrying across the yard, "I didn't expect you to come all this way." "Evelyn." Barrett's expression softened marginally as he looked at his niece, but his voice remained stern. "Thank God you're alive. When I received word of the crash, I feared the worst. As you can see, I survived." Evelyn descended the porch steps carefully, and Colt noticed how she kept one hand on the rail for support. She was stronger than she'd been, but still far from healed. "Mr. Bennett saved my life. You should be thanking him, not interrogating him." "I am grateful for his assistance," Barrett said, though his tone suggested otherwise. "However, gratitude doesn't excuse the impropriety of your situation. You've been living alone with a man for 2 weeks. "I haven't been alone," Evelyn interrupted firmly. "Mrs. Alvarez and her daughter have been here the entire time, acting as perfectly adequate chaperones. My virtue is intact, if that's what concerns you." "What concerns me," Barrett said, "is that Theodore has been sending increasingly urgent telegrams demanding to know your whereabouts and condition. The man is understandably worried about his fiancée." Something flickered across Evelyn's face. Not grief or longing, but something harder. Resentment, maybe, or defiance. Then you can telegram him back that his fiancée is recovering from injuries sustained in a stage accident and will contact him when she's able. Evelyn, you need to understand the position this puts us in, Barrett said, his tone turning placating. Theodore's family has certain expectations. This delay, these circumstances, they complicate things considerably. We need to return to Cheyenne immediately and begin damage control. I'm not ready to travel yet, Evelyn said, and Colt heard the tremor beneath her steady voice. My hands are still healing, and the doctor said I need at least another week before— What doctor? Barrett demanded. I was told no physician had examined you. The doctor from Redemption Creek came out 6 days ago, Colt interjected. He confirmed what we already knew. Miss Hart had severe frostbite, a concussion, and significant trauma from the accident. He recommended continued rest and recuperation before attempting any travel. Then I'll hire a wagon and drive her to transport her carefully. She can rest just as easily in Cheyenne as she can here. Barrett's jaw set stubbornly. I've already made arrangements at the hotel. We'll leave tomorrow morning. No, Evelyn said, and the word came out stronger than Colt expected. I'm not going. Not yet. Barrett's eyes narrowed. This isn't a request, Evelyn. You're still under my guardianship until you marry, and I'm telling you, you're telling me that your reputation and business dealings matter more than my health and well-being, Evelyn said, her voice rising. You're telling me to ignore the advice of the doctor and risk further injury because it would be inconvenient for you if I stayed here longer. You're telling me, once again, that what I want doesn't matter. What you want is irrelevant when measured against your responsibilities, Barrett snapped. You have obligations, Evelyn, to your family, to Theodore, to the life your father worked so hard to secure for you. My father wanted me to be happy, Evelyn shot back. He wanted me to have choices, to pursue my education and my writing. You're the one who decided I should marry Theodore and abandon everything I cared about. Your father was an idealist who filled your head with nonsense about independence and education. If he'd lived, he'd have seen reason eventually. Barrett took a step toward her. Now stop this childish rebellion and accept reality. You're returning to Cheyenne with me tomorrow, and that's final. Colt had heard enough. He moved to stand beside Evelyn, his presence a physical barrier between her and her uncle. With respect, Mr. Barrett, your niece is an adult woman recovering from a traumatic experience. She's told you she's not ready to leave, and the doctor agrees. Forcing her to travel against medical advice would be dangerous and, frankly, cruel. This doesn't concern you, Bennett, Barrett said icily. This is a family matter. It concerns me when it happens on my property and involves someone under my protection, Colt replied, his voice hardening. Miss Hart stays here until she's ready to leave. Not a day sooner. Barrett's face went purple with rage. You have no right. I have every right. This is my land, and she's my guest. You want to take her? You'll have to convince her to go willingly, and from where I'm standing, that doesn't seem likely. The two men stared at each other, the tension thick enough to cut. Finally, Barrett turned to Evelyn with barely controlled fury. Is this really what you want? To throw away your future, your reputation, everything, to stay here with this cowboy? Evelyn's chin lifted. What I want is to make my own decisions for once in my life, and right now that means staying here until I'm well enough to think clearly about what comes next. You'll regret this, Barrett warned. Theodore won't wait forever. If you don't return soon, he'll break the engagement, and then where will you be? No respectable man will have you after this scandal. Then I suppose I'll have to learn to live without the approval of respectable men, Evelyn said, and Colt heard the echo of his own philosophy in her words. I'd rather be scandalous and free than respectable and trapped. For a long moment, Barrett seemed to struggle with himself. Then he shook his head in disgust. Fine. Stay here and play at frontier life if it makes you feel independent. But when reality sets in and you realize what you've thrown away, don't come crying to me for help. He mounted his horse with jerky movements. I'll give you 1 month. If you haven't returned to Cheyenne by then, I'm washing my hands of you entirely. Your inheritance, your allowance, everything. It all goes away. You'll be on your own. I understand, Evelyn said quietly. Barrett looked like he wanted to say more, but instead he just wheeled his horse around and spurred it into a canter back the way he'd come. They watched him go in silence, his figure growing smaller against the vast white landscape until he disappeared entirely. Only then did Evelyn's composure crack. She swayed on her feet, and Colt caught her elbow to steady her. She was trembling, he realized, shaking like a leaf in a storm. "I just cut myself off from everything," she whispered, her eyes wide with shock at what she'd done. "My uncle, my inheritance, Theodore, my entire life in Boston. What have I done?" "You chose yourself," Colt said simply. "That's nothing to regret." "But what if he's right? What if this is just some foolish rebellion and in a month I'll realize I made a terrible mistake?" "Then you'll deal with that when it comes. But living your life based on what-ifs and maybes, that's no way to live at all." Colt guided her back toward the house. "Come on, let's get you inside before you collapse. We can worry about the future later." Nora met them at the door, her face tight with concern. She'd clearly heard everything through the open window. "That man," she muttered darkly, "threatening a girl who just survived death itself. No shame." "He's scared," Evelyn said, surprising them both. "He doesn't know how to handle me not following the script he wrote. And he's probably right about some of it. I am throwing away my old life without any real plan for what comes next." "Plans are overrated," Colt said. "Most of life happens in the spaces between our plans anyway." Maria appeared with hot tea and gentle hands, settling Evelyn back on the sofa by the fire. The girl had come out of her shell considerably over the past 2 weeks, and now she sat beside Evelyn and took her bandaged hands carefully. "You were very brave," Maria said in her soft voice, "standing up to him like that." "I don't feel brave," Evelyn admitted. "I feel terrified." "Bravery is being terrified and doing the thing anyway," Nora said firmly. "You did right, child. A man who threatens to abandon you for choosing yourself isn't worth keeping anyway." But despite their reassurances, Evelyn couldn't shake the feeling that she'd just stepped off a cliff into darkness, with no idea where or how she'd land. She'd given herself 1 month to figure out her future, and the clock was already ticking. The days that followed took on a different quality, charged with urgency that hadn't been there before. Evelyn threw herself into learning everything she could about ranch life with an almost desperate determination. She helped Nora in the kitchen despite her still clumsy hands, practiced her writing for hours each day, and began taking short walks around the property to rebuild her strength. "You're pushing too hard," Colt warned one evening, finding her in the barn attempting to curry Thor despite her bandaged fingers. "Healing takes time." "I don't have time," Evelyn said, not looking up from her work. "I have 1 month to prove to myself that I can make a life here. That means learning to do things for myself, not depending on everyone else's charity." "It's not charity when it's freely given," Colt said, taking the curry brush from her hands. "And you won't prove anything by injuring yourself further. Strength isn't about pushing through pain. It's about knowing when to rest so you can fight another day." "Is that what you did after Sarah died?" Evelyn challenged. "Rested and took your time healing?" The blow landed, and she saw it in the way Colt's expression shuddered. "No," he admitted after a long pause. "I worked myself half to death trying to outrun the grief. Nearly killed myself and the ranch both before Nora finally knocked some sense into me. You want to follow that example?" "I want to matter," Evelyn said, her voice breaking. "I want to pull my weight and contribute something instead of just being a burden people tolerate out of pity." "You're not a burden," Colt said firmly. He set down the brush and turned her to face him, his hands gentle on her shoulders. "You're a person who's recovering from trauma, and that takes time. Nobody here pities you, Evelyn. We care about you. There's a difference." She looked up into his gray eyes and saw something there that made her breath catch. Concern, yes, but also something deeper, something that looked almost like tenderness. "I don't know how to accept care without feeling like I owe something in return," she confessed. "In my world, everything is a transaction." "Then unlearn it," Colt said. "Out here, we take care of each other because that's how we survive. Today I help you, tomorrow you help someone else, next month they help me. It's not about debts and obligations. It's about community." "I don't know if I can be part of a community," Evelyn said. "I've spent my whole life being separate, set apart by class and breeding and expectations. I don't know how to just belong." "You already do," Colt said simply. "You think Nora teaches her recipes to just anyone? You think Maria would sit beside someone she didn't trust? You've already become part of this place, Evelyn. You just haven't realized it yet." The words settled into her chest, warm and solid. Could it really be that simple? Could belonging be something you stumbled into rather than something you had to earn? That night, she wrote in Sarah's journal about the confrontation with her uncle and her conversation with Colt. She wrote about fear and choice, about the difference between the life she'd been given and the life she might create. And she wrote about the growing awareness that her feelings for Colt had shifted from gratitude to something far more complicated. She wasn't naive enough to call it love, not yet, anyway. But there was something there, a connection forged in crisis and tempered through the quiet intimacy of daily life. She found herself watching for him throughout the day, noting the way he moved with unconscious grace, the rare smiles that transformed his stern face, the gentleness in his calloused hands when he thought no one was looking. More troubling was the realization that he watched her too. She'd catch him studying her across the dinner table or glancing her way when he thought she was absorbed in her writing. And sometimes, when their hands would brush passing a dish or their eyes would meet across the room, she'd feel a charge in the air between them that had nothing to do with gratitude or simple friendship. It was dangerous, this growing attachment. She was still technically engaged to Theodore, still under her uncle's guardianship, still a woman with a complicated past and an uncertain future. And Colt was still grieving his wife, still carrying wounds that might never fully heal. Neither of them was in a position to act on whatever was building between them. But that didn't make it any less real. The turning point came 3 weeks after the crash, on a clear Sunday morning when Colt announced they'd be riding into Redemption Creek for church services. Evelyn panicked at first. She wasn't ready to face a town full of strangers, wasn't ready for the questions and judgment she knew would come. But Nora was firm. "You can't hide here forever," the older woman said, helping Evelyn into one of Maria's better dresses, altered to fit. "People need to see you're alive and well, and you need to see that this community isn't like the one you left behind." The ride into town was Evelyn's first time on horseback since the accident. Colt had saddled a gentle mare named Daisy, and he rode close beside her on Thor, ready to catch her if she faltered. But she didn't falter. Her hands were strong enough now to hold the reins, and her body remembered the rhythm of riding even if her muscles protested the effort. Redemption Creek was small, a single main street lined with wooden buildings that looked like they'd been thrown up quickly and might blow away in a strong wind. But what it lacked in polish, it made up for in character. The church was the largest building, whitewashed and standing proud with a simple bell tower. People were already gathering when they arrived, families in their Sunday best greeting each other with easy familiarity. Evelyn felt every eye turn to her as they dismounted. She heard the whispers, saw the curious stares. But instead of judgment, what she saw in most faces was sympathy and welcome. These were people who understood hardship, who knew what it meant to survive against the odds. The preacher, a weathered man named Josiah Cole, greeted them warmly at the door. "Miss Hart, I presume? We've been praying for you. The whole town grieved when we heard about the stage crash." "Thank you," Evelyn managed, overwhelmed by the genuine warmth in his voice. "Colt Bennett is a good man," Cole continued. "One of the best I know. You were blessed that he found you." "I know," Evelyn said, glancing at Colt. He looked uncomfortable with the praise, his jaw tight. "I owe him my life." "We all owe each other," Cole said. "That's the nature of community. Now come in, come in. Service is about to start." The church was simple inside, just rows of wooden benches and a plain pulpit. But it was warm and full of people who smiled at her as she passed. Colt led her to a pew near the front where Nora and Maria were already seated, and she found herself surrounded by kindness that asked for nothing in return. The service was unlike any she'd attended in Boston. There were no elaborate rituals, no formal liturgy, just simple hymns sung with more enthusiasm than skill, and a sermon about resilience and grace that brought tears to Evelyn's eyes. Cole spoke about surviving winter, both literal and metaphorical, and finding hope in unexpected places. "Sometimes," he said, his voice carrying through the small space, "God puts us through fire not to destroy us, but to burn away everything that isn't essential. And what's left, the core of who we really are, that's what matters. That's what endures." Evelyn felt those words settle into her bones. Wasn't that exactly what had happened to her? The stage crash had burned away her old life, leaving only the essential truth of who she was beneath all the social conditioning. And that truth, frightening as it was, felt more real than anything she'd known before. After the service, people surrounded them with questions and well wishes. Mrs. Henderson, the schoolteacher who'd taken over after Sarah died, pressed a jar of honey into Evelyn's hands. "For healing," she said, "my grandmother's recipe." Old Doc Morrison, who'd examined Evelyn the week before, checked her bandages and pronounced himself satisfied with her progress. "You're tougher than you look, young lady. Most city folk wouldn't have lasted an hour in that storm." And on it went, person after person offering small kindnesses, sharing stories, making her feel like she belonged to something larger than herself. By the time they left, Evelyn felt exhausted but strangely buoyed. These people had accepted her without reservation, had welcomed her into their community simply because she needed welcoming. On the ride home, she voiced this to Colt. "They're so different from people in Boston. No one asked about my family connections or my prospects. They just cared." "That's because out here, what matters is what you do, not who you are," Colt said. "A person's worth is measured in character and effort, not bloodlines and bank accounts. It takes some getting used to if you're not raised to it." "I think I prefer it," Evelyn admitted. "It feels more honest somehow." "It is," Colt agreed. "But it's also harder in some ways. You can't coast on your name or your inheritance. Everything you get, you have to earn. Are you ready for that?" "I don't know," Evelyn said honestly, "but I want to try. I want to be someone who matters because of what I do, not what I was born into." Colt smiled, a real smile that reached his eyes. "Then you'll do just fine out here." That evening, gathered around the dinner table with Nora and Maria, Evelyn made a decision. "I want to learn to shoot," she announced, "and I want to learn to really ride, not just sit pretty on a horse. And I want to help with the ranch work, whatever that involves. If I'm going to stay here, if this is going to be my life, then I need to learn to do it properly." Nora and Maria exchanged glances. Colt set down his fork and studied her seriously. "That's a lot to take on. The work is hard and it doesn't get easier just because you want it to." "I know," Evelyn said, "but I'm done being helpless. I'm done letting fear or propriety or other people's expectations stop me from becoming who I need to be." She met Colt's eyes steadily. "Will you teach me?" For a long moment, he said nothing. Then, slowly, he nodded. "Yeah, I'll teach you. But you follow my instructions exactly. No arguments. Deal?" "Deal," Evelyn agreed. "Then we start tomorrow," Colt said. "And I'm warning you now, you're going to hate me by the end of the first week." "I'll risk it," Evelyn said, and meant it. She had 1 month to prove to herself that she could build a life here. 1 month to become someone who could survive and thrive in this hard, beautiful land. 1 month to figure out if the feelings growing between her and Colt were real or just the result of proximity and shared trauma. It wasn't much time, but then again, her entire world had changed in a single night of snow and terror. Maybe a month was enough to change it again, this time on her own terms. True to his word, Colt woke Evelyn before dawn the next morning. She stumbled from her makeshift bed on the sofa, her body still heavy with sleep, to find him already dressed and waiting by the door with 2 cups of steaming coffee. "Ranching starts early," he said, handing her one of the cups. "Animals don't care if you're tired or sore. They need tending regardless." Evelyn wrapped her hands around the warm ceramic, grateful for both the heat and the bitter caffeine. Outside the window, the world was still dark, stars fading as the first gray hints of dawn touched the eastern sky. "What do we do first?" "First, you learn to feed livestock without getting trampled. Then we'll work on your riding. After that, if you're not too exhausted, I'll teach you basic marksmanship." He studied her carefully. "You can back out any time. No shame in admitting this life isn't for you." "I'm not backing out," Evelyn said firmly, though her stomach churned with nervousness. "I told you, I'm done being helpless." The next hours passed in a blur of activity that left Evelyn breathless and aching. Colt showed her how to distribute hay to the horses, how to check their hooves for stones, how to read their body language for signs of illness or distress. He taught her the difference between good feed and moldy grain, explained the delicate balance of keeping animals healthy through winter, and demonstrated a dozen small tasks that seemed simple until she tried them herself. Her bandaged hands made everything harder. The pitchfork was heavy and awkward, and she could barely grip it properly. Twice she dropped hay bales she was trying to move. When she attempted to lift a water bucket, it sloshed over her boots, soaking them through. "Stop," Colt said after watching her struggle with the third bucket. "You're trying too hard. Let the tool do the work, not your arms." He positioned himself behind her, his hands covering hers on the bucket handle. "Feel that? You're tensing every muscle. Relax. Use your legs and back, not just your grip." Evelyn was acutely aware of his closeness, the warmth of his body against her back, his breath stirring her hair. She forced herself to focus on the task, following his instructions until the bucket moved more smoothly. When he stepped away, she felt oddly bereft. "Better," he said, his voice neutral. "Now do it 10 more times until it becomes second nature." By the time they finished the morning chores, Evelyn's arms trembled with exhaustion and her hands screamed in protest beneath their bandages. But she'd done it, completed every task Colt set her without complaint or quitting. It was a small victory, but it felt monumental. "You did good," Colt said as they walked back toward the house for breakfast. "Most people give up after the first hour, but you've got grit, I'll give you that." "Is that a compliment?" Evelyn asked, too tired to hide her smile. "It's the truth. Grit matters more than anything else out here. Talent, education, breeding, none of that means much when you're facing down a blizzard or a broke fence line. But grit? That'll keep you alive when nothing else will." Nora had breakfast waiting, eggs and bacon and biscuits that melted on the tongue. Evelyn devoured her plate with unladylike enthusiasm, suddenly ravenous in a way she'd never experienced in Boston. Physical labor, she was discovering, created an honest hunger that fancy dinners could never satisfy. After breakfast, Colt took her to the paddock where Daisy waited, already saddled. "Today you learn to really ride, Chitich," he said. "Not that prissy side saddle nonsense they teach ladies back east. You're going to ride astride like you mean it." Evelyn's cheeks flushed. That's improper." "That's practical. You can't control a horse properly sitting sideways, and you can't help with ranch work if you're worried about showing your ankles." Colt's expression was challenging. "You said you wanted to learn to do things properly. This is how it's done out here. You got a problem with that?" Evelyn thought of all the times she'd been told what was proper, what was acceptable, what ladies did and didn't do. She thought of the cage those rules had built around her, restricting her movements and her choices until she could barely breathe. Then she thought of the freedom she'd glimpsed in the past 3 weeks, the possibility of becoming someone new. "No," she said, lifting her chin. "No problem at all." Learning to ride astride was harder than she expected. Her muscles, unused to the position, protested immediately. Maintaining her balance required constant adjustment, and her weak hands struggled to manage the reins effectively. But Colt was patient, never mocking her mistakes, always offering clear instruction and quiet encouragement. "Loosen your grip," he'd say. "The horse feels your tension. You need to trust her." Or, "Don't fight the movement. Rock with it. Let yourself feel the rhythm." Hours passed. The sun climbed higher, warming the frozen landscape. Evelyn's thighs burned and her back ached, but gradually she began to understand what Colt meant about rhythm and trust. Daisy was a gentle teacher, patient with Evelyn's mistakes, and slowly, so slowly, Evelyn began to feel like they were moving together rather than fighting each other. "Good," Colt said, watching from Thor's back as Evelyn completed a circuit of the paddock at a steady trot. "You're getting it. Another week of this, and you'll be ready to ride fence lines with me." The praise warmed her more than the winter sun. She'd spent her life achieving things that earned approval, playing piano, speaking French, mastering the complex rules of etiquette, but none of those accomplishments had felt as satisfying as the simple validation that she was learning to survive. That afternoon, Colt set up targets in the empty field beyond the barn, old bottles and tin cans balanced on fence posts. He handed Evelyn a rifle, showing her how to check that it was loaded, how to sight down the barrel, how to breathe and squeeze rather than jerk the trigger. "Shooting is about patience and control," he explained. "You rush it, you miss. You get emotional, you miss. You have to find that quiet place inside yourself where nothing exists except you and the target." Evelyn's first shot went wildly astray, the recoil nearly knocking her backward. Her second wasn't much better. By the 10th attempt, her shoulder ached from the rifle's kick, and she'd yet to hit a single target. I'm terrible at this, she said, frustration bleeding into her voice. You're learning, Colt corrected. There's a difference. He moved behind her again, adjusting her stance, repositioning the rifle against her shoulder. You're anticipating the recoil, flinching before you even shoot. That's why you're missing. Trust the weapon. Trust yourself. That seems to be a theme with you, Evelyn observed. Trust this. Trust that. What if I don't know how to trust anymore? Colt was quiet for a moment. Then you practice until you remember. Trust is like any other skill. It gets stronger the more you use it. His hand steadied the rifle, guided her aim. Now, breathe in. Let it out slowly. Find that stillness. And when you're ready, not when I say when you're ready, squeeze the trigger. Evelyn closed her eyes briefly, searching for that quiet place he'd described. She thought of the storm, of the moment when she'd given up and let herself fall into the snow. She thought of Colt's voice cutting through her despair. You'll make it home with me. She thought of every moment since when she'd chosen to fight rather than surrender. She opened her eyes, sighted down the barrel, and squeezed. The bottle exploded in a shower of glass. There, Colt said, and she could hear the smile in his voice. That's how it's done. The days blurred into weeks, each one packed with lessons and labor that reshaped Evelyn's body and mind. Her hands healed, the bandages coming off to reveal pink new skin that was tender but functional. Her muscles strengthened, adapting to the constant physical demands. She learned to read weather in the clouds, to predict a horse's mood from the set of its ears, to shoot well enough that Colt trusted her with a rifle when they rode out to check the herd. She learned other things too, things that couldn't be taught but had to be lived. She learned the satisfaction of completing hard work, of earning her rest rather than simply expecting it. She learned the deep peace that came from physical exhaustion, the way her body would sink into sleep without the anxiety that had plagued her in Boston. She learned that competence built confidence in a way that compliments never could. And she learned slowly and with growing certainty that she was falling in love with Colt Bennett. It wasn't the romantic fantasies she'd read about in novels, no grand declarations or sweeping gestures. It was quieter than that, more real. It was in the way he'd wait for her to catch up when they rode together, never making her feel slow or inadequate. It was in the pride she saw in his eyes when she mastered a new skill, and the gentle way he'd correct her mistakes without criticism. It was in the evenings by the fire when they'd sit in comfortable silence, both reading or writing, content simply to share space. It was in the way he'd started smiling more, laughing at Maria's jokes and engaging with Nora's gentle teasing. The grief was still there. Evelyn could see it in quiet moments when he thought no one was watching, but it no longer consumed him entirely. He was healing too, she realized. They were healing each other without even trying. But acknowledging her feelings and acting on them were different things entirely. Evelyn was still technically engaged, still technically under her uncle's guardianship. And Colt had given no indication that he felt anything beyond friendship and maybe a sense of responsibility for the woman he'd saved. The few times their hands brushed or their eyes held a moment too long, he'd pull away first, maintaining the careful distance he'd established between them. It hurt, that distance. But Evelyn understood it. He was protecting himself, protecting them both from complications neither was ready to face. 3.5 weeks after her uncle's visit, a letter arrived from Cheyenne. Evelyn's hand shook as she opened it, recognizing her uncle's precise handwriting. Inside was a single sheet of paper with a brief cold message. Evelyn, Theodore has broken your engagement, citing your continued absence and scandalous living arrangements as proof of your unsuitability as a wife. Your allowance will cease at the end of the month as previously stated. If you wish to reconcile, you must return to Cheyenne immediately and submit to my authority regarding your future. If you do not, consider our familial ties severed. The choice is yours. Henry Barrett. Evelyn read the letter twice, then a third time, waiting for the devastation she thought should come. But instead, she felt only relief. The last tie to her old life had been cut, leaving her free to choose her own path forward without guilt or obligation. Bad news? Colt asked, watching her face carefully. No, Evelyn said slowly, a smile spreading across her face. Actually, it might be the best news I've received in years. Theodore broke our engagement. My uncle has disowned me. I'm completely, utterly free. Free and broke, and Nora pointed out practically from her chair. Child, what will you do? It was the question Evelyn had been avoiding for weeks. What would she do? She had no money, no prospects, no family willing to take her in. She had learned to work, but she wasn't skilled enough yet to hire on as ranch help anywhere. The most sensible course would be to swallow her pride, return to Cheyenne, and beg her uncle's forgiveness. But the thought made her stomach turn. She'd rather starve than go back to that cage. I'll figure something out, she said with more confidence than she felt. Maybe I could work in Redemption Creek. Mrs. Henderson mentioned the school needs help, and I can read and write well enough to teach. Or you could stay here, Colt interrupted quietly. Everyone turned to look at him. He was staring into the fire, his jaw tight with tension. What? Evelyn breathed. You could stay here, Colt repeated, still not meeting her eyes. Help Nora with the house and the cooking. Continue learning ranch work. You pull your weight, more than pull it, actually. And you... He trailed off, seeming to struggle with his words. You fit here. It wouldn't be charity. It would be a job, same as Nora and Maria have. You'd earn your keep. Evelyn's heart hammered against her ribs. Colt, I can't ask you to... You're not asking. I'm offering. Finally, he looked at her, and the intensity in his gray eyes stole her breath. These past few weeks, having you here, it's changed things. Changed me. The house feels less empty. The work feels less like I'm just going through motions. You make me want to... He stopped abruptly, seeming to catch himself. Point is, I'd like you to stay, if you want to. The air in the room felt charged, heavy with everything neither of them was saying. Nora was watching them both with knowing eyes, a small smile playing at her lips. Maria had gone very still, her knitting forgotten in her lap. I want to, Evelyn said, her voice barely above a whisper. More than anything. But Colt, people will talk. A single woman living with a single man, no matter how many chaperones are present, it's not proper. It could damage your reputation in town. Let them talk, Colt said flatly. Anyone worth knowing won't judge, and anyone who judges isn't worth knowing. Besides, he paused, his jaw working. There's a way to make it proper, if you're willing. Evelyn's breath caught. What do you mean? Colt stood abruptly, crossed to where she sat, and dropped to one knee in front of her. His calloused hands took hers gently, carefully, like she was something precious that might break. Evelyn Hart, he said, his voice rough with emotion. I'm not good with pretty words, and I can't offer you the fancy life you were raised for. What I can offer is this ranch, this life, and a man who's done grieving what he lost and is ready to fight for what he's found. He took a shaky breath. I'm asking you to marry me. Not because it's proper or convenient, but because somewhere between pulling you from that snow and watching you learn to shoot, I fell in love with you. And I hope, you might feel the same. Tears spilled down Evelyn's cheeks, but she was smiling through them. You think right, she said, her voice breaking. I love you, Colt Bennett. I love your stubbornness and your kindness and the way you never gave up on me even when I'd given up on myself. She squeezed his hands. Yes. 1,000 times, yes. The kiss that followed was nothing like the chaste pecks Evelyn had received from Theodore during their formal courtship. This was real and raw and full of all the emotion they'd been holding back for weeks. Colt's hands came up to cup her face with a tenderness that made her ache, and she wound her arms around his neck, pulling him closer, wanting to memorize every detail of this moment. When they finally broke apart, both breathing hard, Nora was wiping tears from her eyes and Maria was grinning broadly. About time, Nora said. I was beginning to think you two would dance around each other forever. You knew? Evelyn asked, embarrassed. Child, everyone knew. The whole town has been taking bets on when Colt would finally work up the courage to propose. Nora stood, smoothing her apron. Now, we have a wedding to plan. Nothing fancy. We'll keep it simple, the way things are done out here. But Maria and I will make sure it's beautiful. When? Evelyn asked, looking up at Colt. Soon, he said firmly. I've waited 3 years to feel alive again. I'm not waiting any longer than necessary to make you my wife. They were married 2 weeks later in the same church where Evelyn had first felt welcomed into the community. The ceremony was simple but perfect. Evelyn wore a dress that Maria had sewn, pale blue like the sky over the mountains, and carried wildflowers that Colt had ridden to the high meadow to pick. Nora stood as her attendant, and the doctor from town stood up with Colt. The church was packed with people Evelyn had come to know over the past weeks, neighbors and friends who'd embraced her without reservation, who saw her not as a scandal or a burden, but simply as one of their own. Mrs. Henderson wept openly. Old Doc Morrison beamed with grandfatherly pride. The Henderson boys, who'd been teaching Evelyn to rope cattle, whooped enthusiastically when Preacher Cole pronounced them man and wife. The kiss Colt gave her sealed more than just their marriage vows. It sealed a promise that they would build something new together, something neither could have created alone. When they finally pulled apart, Evelyn saw tears tracking down Colt's weathered face. "Sarah would have liked you," he whispered against her hair. "She'd be happy I found you." "I wish I could have known her," Evelyn said honestly, "but I'll honor her memory by taking care of the man she loved and the home she built." The reception was held in the church hall, tables laden with food that the whole community had contributed. There was fiddle music and dancing, laughter and toasts, the kind of celebration that came from genuine joy rather than social obligation. Evelyn danced with Colt, with Doc Morrison, with half the men in town, her feet aching but her heart soaring. As the sun set, painting the sky in shades of pink and gold, Colt pulled her outside for a moment alone. They stood together on the church steps, looking out over the snow-covered landscape that had nearly killed her and had ultimately saved her. "Any regrets?" Colt asked quietly. Evelyn thought about everything she'd lost. Her inheritance, her family connections, the comfortable life she could have had if she'd just played by society's rules. Then she thought about everything she'd gained: freedom, purpose, a community that valued her for who she was, rather than what she represented, and most importantly, love that was real and hard-won and worth every sacrifice. "Not a single one," she said, leaning into his warmth. "You promised me I'd make it home with you. I just didn't realize you were offering me a home I'd actually want." "Took me a while to realize it too," Colt admitted. "Spent 3 years thinking I'd never feel at home anywhere again. Then you stumbled into my life half frozen and stubborn as hell, and suddenly home was wherever you were." They stood there as darkness fell and stars began to emerge, the same stars that had witnessed Evelyn's desperate flight through the snow and her equally desperate choice to keep fighting. She thought about the woman she'd been then, terrified and trapped, and convinced her life was over. She thought about the woman she was now, strong and free, and just beginning to understand what life could be. "Thank you," she said softly, "for finding me, for giving me a reason to survive." "Thank you for surviving," Colt replied, "for choosing life when it would have been easier to give up, for choosing me when you could have gone back to your old world." "That was never a choice," Evelyn said. "That world was a beautiful prison. This—" She gestured to the vast wilderness around them, to the warm lights of the church behind them, to the man standing solid and steady at her side. "This is freedom." They returned to the ranch that night as husband and wife, Nora and Maria following in the wagon with wedding gifts and leftover food. The house that had sheltered Evelyn through her recovery now welcomed her as its mistress, and she felt the rightness of it settle into her bones. That night, curled against Colt's chest in the bed that had been his alone for 3 long years, Evelyn thought about the strange path that had led her here. The stage crash that should have killed her, the storm that should have claimed her, the choices that should have been impossible but somehow weren't. "What are you thinking about?" Colt murmured, his fingers tracing lazy patterns on her shoulder. "About fate," Evelyn said. "About whether we make our own choices or if we're just following a path that was laid out for us." "Both, maybe," Colt said thoughtfully. "The storm brought you to me. That was fate, or luck, or God, depending on what you believe. But everything after, that was choice. You chose to fight. I chose to find you. We chose each other. That's not fate. That's courage." Evelyn turned in his arms to face him. "I used to think courage meant not being afraid, but I've been afraid every day since the crash. Terrified, actually. Of failing, of being a burden, of making the wrong choices. I'm still afraid sometimes." "That's what makes it courage," Colt said. "Doing the thing despite the fear. You've shown more courage in the past month than most people manage in a lifetime." We both have, Evelyn corrected. It takes courage to love again after loss, to open your heart knowing it could break. Worth the risk, though, Colt said, pressing a kiss to her forehead. Every time. The months that followed were hard in ways Evelyn had never imagined. Winter deepened, bringing storms that trapped them inside for days at a time. She learned to endure cabin fever, to find peace in the forced stillness. She learned that ranch work was relentless and unforgiving, that animals needed care regardless of weather or exhaustion or personal comfort, but she also learned joy in its purest form. Joy in watching sunrise paint the mountains gold. Joy in the simple satisfaction of a meal she'd cooked herself with food she'd helped produce. Joy in falling asleep exhausted beside a man who loved her exactly as she was, without requiring her to be anything more or less. She continued writing in Sarah's journal, filling page after page with observations about her new life. Eventually, she began submitting pieces to newspapers in Cheyenne and Denver, writing under a pseudonym about frontier life and the women who chose it. To her surprise and delight, editors began accepting her work, then requesting more. The money wasn't much, but it was hers, earned through her own effort, belonging to no one but herself. You were right, she told Colt one evening, showing him her first payment, about finding that quiet place inside myself. I found it, and it turns out there are words there. Stories worth telling. I'm proud of you, Colt said simply, and the words warmed her more than any grand praise could have. Spring came eventually, as it always did, transforming the frozen landscape into something alive and green. The snow melted, revealing the earth beneath, and with it came a sense of renewal that felt almost symbolic. They rode together to the high meadow where Colt had picked Evelyn's wedding flowers, and stood at the place where a simple wooden cross marked Sarah's grave. Evelyn had feared this moment, worried she might feel like an interloper or a replacement, but standing there with Colt's hand warm in hers, she felt only gratitude. Gratitude to Sarah for loving this good man and teaching him how to love. Gratitude for the journal that had given Evelyn's voice somewhere to live. Gratitude for the home Sarah had built that now sheltered them both. Thank you, Evelyn whispered to the woman who'd never know her. For him, for everything. I'll take care of them both, the man and the dream, I promise. Later that spring, Nora announced that she and Maria would be moving into the small house on the southern edge of the property that Jose had built, but never finished. You two need your privacy, she said firmly when Evelyn protested. And Maria's getting old enough to need her own space. Besides, I'm not going far, just far enough to pretend I don't hear what I don't need to hear. Her meaning was clear, and Evelyn blushed scarlet while Colt tried unsuccessfully to hide his laughter. The house felt strange with just the two of them, larger somehow, and more intimately theirs. But it was a good strange, full of possibility. They talked about the future over breakfast, made plans over dinner, and discovered each other in the quiet hours between. By summer, Evelyn could ride as well as any ranch hand, shoot straight enough to bring down game for the table, and manage the household with efficient confidence. She'd published a dozen articles about frontier life and was working on something longer, a memoir perhaps, or a novel loosely based on her own experience. The words came easily now, flowing from a well that seemed bottomless. One evening in July, they rode together to the creek where Evelyn's stage had overturned. The wreckage had been cleared away, but you could still see the scar in the earth where it had happened. Evelyn dismounted and stood at the edge, looking down at the place where 5 people had died, and she had chosen to live. Do you think about them? Colt asked quietly. The others? Every day, Evelyn admitted. I wonder who they might have become if they'd lived. What dreams they had, what futures they were denied. And I wonder why I survived when they didn't. Maybe there's no answer to that, Colt said. Maybe it's just random chance, and trying to find meaning in it will drive you mad. Or maybe, Evelyn said slowly, maybe the meaning isn't in why I survived, but in what I do with the survival. Mrs. Patterson told me on the stage that she was traveling to see her daughter's new baby, that she'd almost canceled because of the weather, but decided life was too short to miss important moments. She turned to face Colt. She was right. Life is too short. So I'm going to live it fully, for myself and for them. I'm going to write their stories so they're not forgotten, and I'm going to build something beautiful with you, because that's the best way I know to honor the gift they unknowingly gave me. Colt pulled her close, holding her against his heart. "You're the strongest person I've ever known," he said. "Stronger than me, for certain." "No," Evelyn said. "We're strong together. That's the difference. Alone, we were both just surviving. Together, we're actually living." As they rode home through the golden evening light, Evelyn thought about the journey that had brought her here, the desperation that had driven her onto that ill-fated stage, the storm that had nearly claimed her life, the cowboy who'd refused to let her die, the choices, both small and large, that had led her to this moment. She thought about the woman she'd been, trapped and unhappy, slowly suffocating under the weight of expectations she couldn't meet and didn't want to. And she thought about the woman she'd become, scarred but whole, free in ways that went deeper than geography or social standing. The ranch house appeared on the horizon, its windows glowing warm in the gathering dusk. Home. Real home, in every sense of the word. Not the place where she'd been forced to be, but the place where she'd chosen to stay, where she was loved not for what she could provide or what family she came from, but simply for being herself. As they unsaddled the horses and put them up for the night, as they walked hand in hand to the house where supper waited and their future beckoned, Evelyn realized something profound. She'd spent her whole life searching for a place to belong, for a life that felt authentic, for love that didn't come with conditions. And she'd found it all in the last place she'd ever expected, in the arms of a grieving cowboy who'd promised her one thing and delivered so much more. "You'll make it home with me," he'd said in the storm, and she had. But the home he'd given her wasn't just a place on a map. It was freedom and purpose and partnership. It was mornings working side by side and evenings sharing dreams. It was becoming someone new while honoring who she'd been. It was building something that belonged to them both and them alone. That night, as they sat together by the fire, Colt with his book, Evelyn with her writing, she paused to watch him in the flickering light. This man who'd saved her life and then given her a reason to treasure it. This man who'd lost everything and found the courage to risk his heart again. This man who was hers now, just as she was his, bound together by choice and chance in equal measure. "What?" Colt asked, catching her staring. "Nothing," Evelyn said, smiling. "Just thinking how lucky I am." "We're both lucky," Colt corrected. "Luckiest damn people alive, if you ask me." And as the fire crackled and the wind sang its endless song across the plains, as the stars wheeled overhead in their ancient patterns, and the mountains stood their silent watch, Evelyn Hart Bennett, formerly of Boston, now and forever of this wild Wyoming territory, knew he was right. She'd fled through the snow expecting to die. Instead, she'd found a way to truly live. And that, she thought, as she set down her pen and moved to join her husband by the fire, was the best story of all. The kind worth surviving for. The kind worth living for. The kind that made every hard choice, every moment of fear, every sacrifice along the way feel not just worthwhile, but inevitable. This was her home, her life, her love, hard-won and freely chosen, as real as the mountains and as enduring as the land itself. And she wouldn't trade it for anything.